Today we're going to talk about how Oda's used every antagonist in the story to foreshadow everything about Emu. Because the thing about Oda is that even when he was writing the East Blue back over 25 years ago, he always knew the ending to his story. He only thought that One Piece would last 5 years. So there's not a single arc or character that he's ever created without knowing how his story will shake out. This means he's almost assuredly known the truth to Emu since the very beginning. And I did a video a while back about how looking through the story through this lens might help us predict his original plan for One Piece, but now I think we can use that very same thing to tell us a whole lot about Emu specifically. Because despite Emu being around for over 230 chapters now, it feels like we've only gotten small morsels of information on Emu. We don't know what they actually look like, what their powers are, their voice is even ambiguous, and we don't know why they are the one accepted as king of the world. But Oda has definitely left some breadcrumbs for us to follow, particularly through his use of parallels and inversions. Even if you somehow haven't heard of this before, you still probably know about it inherently, because it's where Oda takes an arc or a character that he's already established and twists them into a new and often improved version, or one that's just flipped on its head, and sometimes it's a bit of both. And I think this is most obvious between the pre and post time skip, with one of the best examples being Arlong and Hody Jones. Both of them were fishmen who we met at the start of the pre and post time skip respectively. Both of them had it out for the humans, and their pasts were even intertwined with Fisher Tiger. But the inversion is that Arlong already took over Kokoyashi, and Hody was in the midst of taking over Fishman Island. And that same idea exists for Alabasta and Dressrosa. Both islands were controlled by warlords, both islands were ruled by some of the original 20 kings, and both Crocodile and Doflamingo were aided by the fact the government let them do what they wanted. But in Alabasta, Luffy stopped Crocodile in the midst of his takeover, kinda like Hody, but in Dressrosa, Doflamingo took over long before we got there. It's like Oda took the same idea but just gave us a before and after. Then there's also Sabaody and Egghead, which had the very same cast of characters, Kuma, Sentomaru, Pacifistas, Kizaru, but where in Sabaody Kuma had to help us escape separately, we were able to leave together in Egghead and save Kuma this time. So I think you guys get the point. Oda loves his parallels and inversions, and that's why it's become probably the most common tool for people making theories. So I want to go through every villain or arc in the story and talk about how each of them might tell us a thing or two about Emu, since Oda's definitely been building up for this grand finale. So we're going to get into Emu's potential powers, how Joy Boy vs. Emu may have happened, and so much more, including the truth behind those mysterious Thriller Bark monsters. Also, major shout out to Miles for giving me the idea for this video. But before we begin, I want to tell you about Private Internet Access, the sponsor for today's video. When you're streaming shows on Netflix, it sometimes feels like you're paying for front row seats at the movies, but you're just stuck watching reruns. And that's because streaming services like Netflix have different library options depending on where you're located. I mean, just take One Piece for example. Those in Japan already have every current episode available on Netflix already, but here in the US, we only have just over half of them. It literally skips from Punk Hazard all the way to Egghead. But with Private Internet Access VPN, you're able to pick a server in Japan and watch their content as if you were living there. That means that you could go watch every current One Piece episode on Netflix right now if you wanted to, as well as a ton of other anime that you may have never experienced before. And that's all because a Virtual Private Network, or VPN, is an app that hides your IP address and safeguards your internet through an encrypted tunnel. And with Private Internet Access, you can change your IP address to one of 91 different countries and all 50 US states. So that means that you can get access to all that new content and protect your private information at the very same time. It's available for every platform as well, whether you're on your computer or on your phone, and one subscription covers all of your devices. And to top that all off, you can use my link below at piavpn.com/daksake to get 83% off and 4 months free. There's also a 30-day money-back guarantee and 24/7 customer support, so it's completely risk-free. So make sure to go check them out. Thanks again to Private Internet Access for sponsoring, but let's get back to the video. So first up, we have the villains from the East Blue. All of these guys kind of laid the groundwork for the One Piece world as we knew it, which has been manipulated into what it is by Emu over the last 800 years. And that's why even characters like Axe Hand Morgan were so important. He was our first first glimpse into the fact that Marines aren't always the heroes that they're chalked up to be, and that pirates are sometimes the good guys. And this is in large part to the system that Imu has created. Pirates have been vilified pretty much since the time of Joy Boy, since we learned that he was the first pirate. But pirate is basically just a name to criminalize people who act as opposition to the status quo and Imu's plans. And Axehand Morgan was a very good antithesis to that, since he was so self-absorbed. He wasn't about protecting the commoners, but rather ruling with an iron fist, somewhat literally since he has an axe for a hand. We even saw that his son Helmeppo tried to set up Zoro for an execution, despite Zoro doing the right thing earlier. And, you know, Axehand lost rather easily, which also showed he wasn't even strong enough to protect people if he wanted to, kind of showing just how big of a sham the Marines can be. This was Oda making it very clear that the perspective the world has about Marines and pirates is not all that accurate, and that's because Imu has wanted to keep pirates at bay as much as possible, since finding the One Piece will turn the world on its head. Those people are the world government's main opposition, so we kinda got to see here at the very beginning how that anti-pirate, pro-marine propaganda has permeated throughout the entire One Piece world, all the way to a tiny corner of the East Blue. And the reason that Axehand even held that position was because he was credited with defeating Captain Kuro when he didn't actually do so, which makes him a complete fraud. Now, he did cut Garp later on, but he's still a fraud. Instead, he was just hypnotized by Django to say that he was the one responsible, so that Kuro could then successfully escape that life of piracy. And that's something that I think could potentially be a very important parallel for later in the story, because in early One Piece, Oda was all about hypnotism. Django ate a mushroom, which gave him hypnosis powers, Miss Golden Week had paint, which essentially worked as hypnosis, and even Vivi had the captivating dizziness dance, or whatever it's called, which was only in the manga. The anime did a perfume-related one instead. And like I said earlier, since Oda didn't know that One Piece would last this long, whatever he set up early in the story likely holds a lot of weight for the end. So I personally think that hypnotism has to be a relevant part for the Void Century. I mean, perhaps the 20 Kings were just hypnotized into joining Imu. Or what about Lily? Especially if she really did control an ancient weapon. I mean, if Lily is like Vivi, then killing all these innocent people sounds a bit out of her wheelhouse. But if she was hypnotized, well, maybe that's exactly why Vivi had on this hypnosis-looking shirt in her introduction. And I think this is a good chance to talk about Captain Kuro a little bit more, because he used Django's hypnosis to basically hide his true self from the world, and weasel himself in for a life of luxury by taking Kaya's fortune. And Imu has been hiding in secret while being king of the world with a massive fortune this entire time, so there might be a parallel there too. Could that maybe mean that Imu also used to be a pirate back in the day? I mean, if a pirate is someone who challenges the status quo and Imu went against the ancient kingdom, then that would kind of make sense. But there was one important villain that I skipped there, which was Buggy. Now, there's a lot that we can say about Buggy, the man who's fallen upwards all the way to being an emperor of the sea, and a man who is arguably one of, if not the most famous person in the One Piece world at this point, which in some ways makes him an inversion to Imu who hides himself in the shadows. But the parallel to Imu that I want to make here, which I don't see enough people talk about, is the fact that Buggy was the first and only one to damage Luffy's straw hat. And when we first ever saw Imu, we saw that they were in possession of a giant straw hat up in Marijua, one that I think most people presume belonged to Joy Boy, since we did see he had one in that silhouette with Emeth. Buggy and Imu seem to be the only ones to successfully take the straw hat from Luffy or Joy Boy. Even at Marineford, Shanks entrusted Buggy to give that hat back to Luffy. Why are these two connected to the straw hat so closely? I honestly don't know, but I think there's definitely something brewing here. Part of me wonders if Imu was maybe a lot like Buggy before, having a lot of fame and notoriety, and he somehow turned that into becoming the king that he is today. But like I mentioned with Captain Kuro, he maybe then hid his identity from the world so that nobody knew who he really was. And while we're talking about Buggy, I also want to mention that in both the pre and post time skip, we met a clown at the very beginning, with Buggy and Caesar Clown respectively, and both of them made giant bombs. Buggy had the Buggy bombs and Caesar had the Shino Kuni. We also have another clown in the story, Dr. Indigo, who is Shiki's scientist, and he's only appeared in the canon once in chapter 0, but in the movie Strong World, he also used some exploding orb things. Why does every clown in the story blow stuff up? The fact that Imu blew up Lulusia then makes me wonder if there's a connection there too. Is Emu also maybe a clown? And the fact they all use weapons actually ties me to the next East Blue villain, which was Don Krieg. Because Don Krieg was a man who was all about his weapons. He thought those were what gave him strength. And as we recently learned from Vegapunk, the ancient weapons were what caused the flood during the Void Century, and what most recently wiped out Lulusia. Now, thanks to what we saw with Emu vs. Sabo, Emu definitely has some serious fighting prowess on their own as well, but the focus on technology and weaponry has been very apparent as we get deeper into the story. Even the Pacifista or Seraphim could be roped into this discussion since they are essentially living weapons. Now, Krieg was obviously a lot more primitive to these examples, but I think this was just Oda's first example that in One Piece, weapons can be a serious threat. Of course, the lesson we learned is that, your own will and personal strength can still triumph, but at the same time, Oda hasn't made weapons totally useless. If anything, it's the exact opposite. It's just the reliance on them that makes you weak, and I'm curious to see how much that matters as we get closer and closer to fighting Emu. And then the second to last East Blue villain that I want to bring up here is Mihawk, because in the official colored version of the manga, Mihawk has red double-ringed eyes, much like Emu. In the anime, they're colored yellow, so I think a lot of people have missed this, but the fact that Oda not only introduced us to a top-tier fighter, but also made them have red eyes like that has to be some kind of sign for something, I think. Maybe it's telling us that Mihawk and Emu share the same bloodline potentially, or it could also be our first sign that Emu has strong swordsmen underneath him, which we now know is true because of the God's Knights. This has led to a lot of theories over the years that Mihawk could also be related to one of them, much like Shanks is, since they have their own rivalry. And since we just met Shanks' brother, perhaps that will come into play in a major way as well. But to finish off the East Blue, we now need to discuss Arlong. And Arlong is extremely important in regards to Emu for several different reasons, with the first being the fact that he had his own celestial tribute by taking money from the people on Kokoyashi. That's how Belmare died, and Nami had to save up 100 million berries just to earn everyone's freedom. And this is crazy to look back on for me because it basically shows that Arlong took Emu's idea and just used it for his own, because the celestial tribute, which gives the celestial dragons their insane wealth, was what allowed them to buy slaves such as the fishmen. There would have been far less suffering in the world if they just didn't have the money for it. So Arlong, having the distaste for humans that he did, figured he'd just do the same thing, but in reverse, where he's the one taking money from the humans. So this was kind of Oda's way of showing us the after effect of the celestial tribute before we fully understood just how pertinent that really was. I mean, the entire East Blue was basically a showcase of how Emu's decisions have permeated throughout the world in negative ways before we fully understood what all those decisions were. And that all just makes me wonder if Emu's gripes with the Ancient Kingdom originally could have been rooted in basically the same gripes that Arlong had with the world government. Perhaps Emu's peoples were taken advantage of, and thus he sought his revenge. This could also mirror a little bit of what we saw with Orochi, who was from the Kurozumi family, and they had been persecuted for years, and that basically led Orochi to teaming up with Kaido and taking over. Now, truthfully, Orochi didn't care about the Kurozumi at all because he even worked Tama's parents to death, who were also Kurozumi, but this is just a theme that we've seen time and time again, and I feel pretty confident that Emu is somehow going to be in a similar boat. Emu's actions led to Arlong's actions, so there must have been something that led to Emu's actions. Vegapunk also told us not to judge which side was good or evil yet, so there's a lot more to that story than we think. And given the fact that Marijua is also located right above Fishman Island, that makes me wonder if Emu could also just be a fishman. I've heard that theory thrown around before, and I think it does make a lot of sense, but like we said earlier, I could also see Emu being a clown, or just a human, or maybe an alien from space. Honestly, all these parallels we're going through have different elements that seem really convincing, and that's kind of why I made the video. There's so many potential theories we can pull out of this. And now we're going to go ahead and skip to the grand line. Technically, you could say Smoker was the villain of Logtown, but he's more of a Garp parallel than anything. Plus, he's more or less a good guy, so I'll just skip over that. Although, I am ready for you to make Smoker relevant again, Oda. But the first villain that we need to talk about are the ones we met at Reverse Mountain, Vivi and Mr. 9. This, in my opinion, is a massive parallel to Imu because they were our introduction to Baroque Works, who was a group of 20 main members, and Imu led the group known as the 20 Kings. I talked about this parallel a bit more in my most recent video, but since Lily was once alongside Imu and Vivi is here alongside Crocodile, there's something going on here for sure. Crocodile also wanted a weapon to destroy islands, Imu has a weapon to destroy islands, Lily was a traitor, Vivi was a traitor. I mean, it's just so thorough. And that draws my attention to their main goal here, which was killing Laboon, which is 100% sacrilegious, let's be honest. But I do think it's pertinent to Imu because Laboon was the first being to hint to us that the red line should not be there. The fact that he banged his head on it so much, as did the other island whales that we met at the start of the post time skip, which is an important parallel in and of itself, tells us that the red line is not natural. Or at least that specific part isn't natural. It's likely messing up their migration patterns or what have you, and you know, since Imu lives on top of the red line, this has led to a ton of theories over the years that the red line has to come down eventually, which I totally subscribe to. But as far as Imu goes, I think this could also mean that there was another important whale back in the day that Imu wanted to kill, just like Baroque Works did with Laboon. And since Laboon is an island whale and can hold an island inside him, this has also spawned a lot of theories that Laugh-Tail might be inside of a whale. And I think that whale could end up being the very same one that Imu would have wanted to take out, thus fulfilling this parallel with Baroque Works and Laboon. Now, we don't actually know of that whale yet, but that has been tied to my theory on the origins of the D-Clan for quite a while now. Perhaps the D-Clan was just formed over the idea of protecting that whale, much like how Vivi and Luffy became friends after the Straw Hat saved Laboon, and I'll just leave a link to the rest of that video down below. But now we're on to our next villain, and since I already talked about Baroque Works a bit already, and we're going to talk about the Giants later on when we get to Elbaf, I want to skip Whiskey Peak and Little Garden and talk about Drum Island. Because for one thing, the fact that this island is called Drum and Joy Boy's return was signified by the Drums of Liberation is extremely important in and of itself, as is the fact that we found our first human fruit here, but truthfully, Wapol is the biggest key of it all. He was your typical smug, narcissistic leader who was even at the Reverie trying to start fights with other countries. All things I think Imu would do or has done. And Wapol is one of just a handful of living people who've actually seen Imu. But the biggest thing that foreshadows Imu for me was the fact that Wapol had the 20 MDs. Do you remember those guys? They were the 20 most skilled doctors in all of Drum, and Wapol basically monopolized that so people would have to come to him for health services. Now, there's maybe some sad parallels you can make there to the real world, but for One Piece, the connection we should be making is to the 20 Kings. 20 doctors, 20 kings, what could that mean? Well, I think it's a hint that they all may have used the immortal youth surgery. What if Imu also assembled 20 doctors back then and forced them to grant his crew eternal life by doing the surgery over and over? Since we do know that the doctor has to give up their life in order to do it. And keep in mind, we also met Kureha during this arc, who is the oldest living human, and we still don't know her secret as to how she does that. To me, there's definitely something going on here. I've even considered doing a full video just on this topic because this is honestly just the tip of the iceberg in terms of evidence for this theory. Which, you know what, if this video gets to 5k likes, then I will. And I also want to mention that, you know, as far as we know, Imu is the only OG 20 king that's still remaining, which might seem to imply that the other kings didn't get the immortal youth surgery, but remember, the Void Century was 100 years long. And if the 20 kings didn't get that surgery, then they'd likely have died of old age during it, right? And we were told that Lily left Moriah after the Void Century and never returned home, which would seem to indicate that she did live through the entire 100 years. That almost makes me wonder if Imu granted them all immortality before the war started, but then took it away afterward, which would then leave Imu as the only OG king left, and thus why Imu is now considered king of the world. And next up, we have Crocodile, who is one of, if not the best parallel for Imu among all villains in the story, because while Crocodile's plan to gain control of Alabasta involved causing a drought, Imu's plan to take control of the world involved causing a flood. Crocodile also wanted Pluton, a weapon which destroys islands in a single blast, and Imu has a weapon which already did destroy an island in a single blast. And all those parallels I said earlier with Baroque Works and the 20 Kings and Vivi being a traitor and Lily being a traitor and all of that definitely stands here, but there's also some other things I could throw in, like Crocodile almost killed Cobra as he was seeking information on Pluton from him, and Imu did kill Cobra as they asked about the initial D. I mean, hell, we even saw that Crocodile dried out a lily flower in one of our first glimpses of him, and Emu was first found in a flower room with a picture of Lily, who suspiciously never made it home to Alabasta. The connections between these two were almost uncanny, and I think this is a major reason why Alabasta was our first saga in the Grand Line portion of the story. And like I said towards the beginning, Oda thought the story was going to end in 5 years. So that means that things like the Alabasta saga should matter a lot more in terms of its predictability for the end of the story. And I would argue it already has, as it's a great comparison to what we're seeing now in the final saga. It's like the start of the Grand Line is now mirroring what happens as we reach the end of the New World. Even down to the fact that Pluton should be released sometime soon, Vivi is coming back, Crocodile came back via Cross Guild. It's like history is literally repeating itself. And so I think there's a lot that we can use about Alabasta to predict the ending as well. Now, obviously, Oda's going to add a lot of different ideas to Emu to make them feel like their own unique villain as well. It's not going to be a carbon copy, and that's kind of the point of this video, to break down all the angles he might take. But I think one of the big things about Crocodile that might parallel or invert with Emu is his weakness to water, because that was Luffy's key to defeating him, even eventually using the blood on his fist to accomplish the same thing. And as you've probably heard before, Emu spelled backwards is Umi, which is ocean in Japanese. And what do we know about devil fruit users? They are also weak to water, at least when they're submerged to it, which is a bit different than Crocodile, but you get the point. And I think from what we've seen so far with Emu, there's a lot of thematic elements that point to Emu being a devil-esque person. Now, I'm not saying that they are the literal devil or that there even is one in One Piece, but obviously there's some connections here. Not only did Sabo say that hell was found at the top of the world when he saw them, but the Gorosei and the Gods Knights use summoning circles, which likely tie to the underworld because of what we learned in Brook's time skip. So I'm not going to say that it's all just as simple as Emu is weak to water, but maybe he is. If he's the ultimate devil of sorts, then maybe water is key to beating him, just like for devil fruit users. I mean, we still haven't seen anyone drown in One Piece, and maybe the first one will be Emu. Although I'd much prefer Blackbeard, as he's the devil fruit guy, but I digress. But the other side to this is that water could actually end up being Emu's strength instead. Not that he has water powers, mind you, but remember, Vegapunk did tell us that devil fruits drew the ire of Mother Nature, and thus why they lost their ability to swim. Now, he did say that was a theory, which I think is Oda's hint that it's not the full answer, but it's at least setting the stage for some tie between Emu and a sea connection, or at least some tie between the sea and some kind of devil or something. And I mean, Emu did use a flood to help him take over the world, and is trying to do so again, so at a very bare minimum, he's at least using water in that way. And one other important parallel here to make between Emu and Crocodile is that Crocodile used the dance powder to essentially take water from one nation and bring it to another, basically stealing a key resource without them even knowing. And taking resources is something we've already seen the government do, because what was the point of the native cleansing at God Valley? To take all their valuable resources. If you go back to Vegapunk, he said multiple times that without resources, he can't build anything. Resources and money equates to power in a lot of ways, especially in One Piece. And both Crocodile and Emu have used those to their advantage, even allowing entire countries to die out if necessary. And personally, I think that alone tells us a lot about how the Void Century really went down. I also did a video on that a while ago in case you're interested, I'll link it down below, but all in all, Crocodile is definitely a great parallel for Emu, perhaps more than any other character. So the next person on our list is none other than Marshall D. Teach, who we met during Jaya, which gave us the infamous speech about how a man's dream never ends. And what I find so interesting about Blackbeard is that he is arguably just as likely to be a final antagonist as Emu is. I've heard a ton of debates over the years about how that will all shake out, because it's like Luffy has a pirate final villain and a world government final villain. But technically Emu is Blackbeard's enemy as well, so there's kind of like a triangle now. And given Blackbeard's underhanded tactics and the way that he takes advantage of every situation to keep moving upward, I kind of feel like he's probably taking a similar approach right now to what Emu did back in the day. Because I could totally see Emu using every trick in the book to get there. I mean, Blackbeard killed a crewmate for his first fruit and helped kill his adopted father to take the second one. And he's kidnapped several people now to use as leverage, so I could totally see Emu doing the same kind of thing. I mean, he already is in some respects. And I think the way that these two amass their crews could even be similar, because Blackbeard went all the way down to the bottom level of Impel down, which is an allegory for hell from Dante's Inferno, and got 5 new crew members. And Imu has 5 main people under him in the Gorosei who use these summoning circles, which could very well tie to the actual underworld in One Piece because of Brook's time skip. So could Imu have maybe been the literal king of hell at some point, and maybe that's how he got the Gorosei on his side? What if they were all originally demons from the underworld? That might explain why they haven't been said to have devil fruits yet, instead we just got the creature that they truly are. And there's honestly a lot of other stuff I could say here about Teach and Imu, but I think I might save all that for a future video, particularly as we find out what Blackbeard does with Caribou's information. Because if the ancient weapons were used to cause a flood back then, and Blackbeard gets a hold of even 1 or 2 now, well, there's a whole lot more parallels that we could discuss there. So be on the lookout for that video in the future, but I want to go ahead and move on to the next villain now, which would be Enel, who may be the most obvious one in this entire video because he believed himself to be a god, and the celestial dragons call themselves gods of the world. He also destroyed Burka and almost destroyed Skypiea, even leaving a hole in the White Sea in the process. And Imu destroyed Lelucia, of course, and also left a hole in the Blue Sea in that process. We also saw that Enel could sense every living thing on the island using his mantra and his devil fruit combined, and we at least saw the Gorosei could detect every living thing on Egghead. So I would at least imagine that Imu can do the very same thing. But I actually think the biggest thing for Enel is the fact that he was obsessed with the fairy Verth, even going as far to visit there and find out that other pirates were already there during his cover story. We also saw that those pirates had a Jolly Roger in the shape of Vegapunk's head, which has always stood out to me, honestly. I think Vegapunk might be the one who created that group, because how many people can get people on the moon in One Piece, right? But what I think this all means for Imu specifically is that Imu might just be from space, y'all. The Gorosei are also called the 5 Elder Stars and have names based on planets, and given that they seem to be Imu's ride or dies, specifically die in Saturn's case, maybe they're all from someplace else. Plus, they are all called celestial dragons for some reason, right? And when you look back at Enel's cover story, he learned that the sky races left the moon specifically because they ran out of resources and had to go to Earth. They literally left the fairy Verth for the regular Verth, and I think Imu might have done basically the same thing, maybe even taking over the Earth because of how important it truly was. I said earlier, you know, the importance of resources has really been emphasized lately in the story. And the ancient kingdom seemed to be a vast advanced civilization, kind of like Egghead was, which should have required a lot of resources. So could that have been a driver in why Imu did what they did? Did they want to protect Verth, kind of like Enel wanted to protect the fairy Verth by kicking the space pirates off the moon? That's something that I broke down a lot more in my Void Century video in case you're interested, but I think there's no doubt that Enel is one of the most important parallels with Imu that we've ever had. And so for the next villain I want to discuss, we have the GOAT himself, Foxy. If you've been around the channel since the Lafro Tale days, then you already know how important this guy might actually be. But what I want to hone in on this video is mainly his role with the Davy back fight. This is a battle between pirates to take other members of the opposing crew, or in some cases to take their flag so they can't be a crew anymore. And the anime certainly didn't do the Davy back fight any favors, since they added different rounds that weren't in the manga and they just made it feel a lot less serious than it really was. But it's truly a way for pirates to settle disputes with other pirates beyond having a massive brawl. And it also originated on Pirates Paradise Island, which would be Hachinosu, and since it was tied to Davy Jones, I feel like this thing just has to matter a lot more than we think it does right now. Because truthfully, what the Davy backfight is a means for weaker pirates to trick their way to the top. A really weak captain could amass an insanely powerful crew without ever needing to risk their lives. I mean, Foxy won a whopping 920 straight Davy backfights before he fought Luffy. You'd think you'd have a better crew at that point, but regardless, that's really impressive. And that's all thanks in large part to his underhanded tactics. Like I mentioned earlier with Blackbeard, that's something that I feel very certain Imu did at some point in some way, shape, or form. It also reminds me a little bit of Stelly, who has long been one of my top parallels for Imu since he wanted to sit on the empty throne. And the reason he ties into this is that he was adopted into nobility in the first place, then married into royalty, and then killed his wife's dad so that he would become the king. Blackbeard, Stelly, and Foxy are all dudes who will do the scummiest stuff possible to cheat their way to the top, and I am super duper confident that Oda's gonna mesh all these in some way, shape, or form to give us Imu's origins. And personally, I think the Davy backfight would be by far the most fun option for how Imu defeated Joy Boy in the Ancient Kingdom. I mean, just imagine that whole idea, a Davy backfight for the fate of the whole world. And there are a ton of other things that I could say about Long Ring Longland itself, like the fact it might be the home of Laugh Tale, especially since it's a bunch of dots in a circle like the Ancient Kingdom symbol, but I have other videos you can watch for that, and I think all of that just makes the Davy backfight all the more important. And so our next major villain was Cipher Pol, the secret agency who's in charge of investigations, espionage, and assassinations for the world government. And I think their importance in regards to Imu is pretty obvious. It showed us that there's a more covert operation going on in the world government beyond just the Marines. The Marines are like the public-facing heroic group that the world can rally behind, and Cipher Pol does the dirty behind-the-scenes work. They trafficked kids through the House of Lambs, they work to secure important resources like liquor, iron ore, and they've gone on long covert missions to get things like the Pluton blueprints, as we saw with Galley Law. In a lot of ways, this may have hinted to us that someone like Imu probably existed, since it's all tied to the dark underbelly of the world government. So much is being done in secret that it would make sense a secretive leader could be found at the very top. And I think something that Guernica said during Wano could provide an important hint to Imu's abilities, because he told Drake that he envied the fact he was pursuing his own sense of justice. That would then imply that Guernica can't for some reason, and since we saw Saturn get his life sapped away for failing, I think Imu just has something over all these guys. They're almost like forced to be his powerful slaves and do his bidding, and that's why I'm very, very curious to see what Lucci and Kaku do given the aftermath of Egghead. But next we have to move on to the parallel that I was personally most excited to talk about in this video, which is Moriah. Good old Gecko Moriah. Now there's a lot I could say here. I mean, aesthetically, Imu's powers already look kind of similar to Moriah's, since Imu is still all black and Moriah used shadows. Even at Marineford, we saw Moriah use an arrow attack that kind of looked like Imu's attack versus Cobra, and we even saw in chapter 1138 that Shamrock was able to summon a Cerberus using his sword or some kind of dark magic or something, and we also met a Cerberus during Thriller Bark. Obviously that one was like 5% as threatening, but regardless, there's a lot of connections here. And I mean, Moriah brought people back from the dead by using shadows, and again, Imu uses these pentagrams, which are probably underworld related. Moriah also kept ores in a giant freezer, and Imu kept the giant straw hat in a freezer, and as soon as ores got out of the freezer, he tried putting a hat on his head, which then makes me wonder who's going to try putting Imu's straw hat on their head. Plus, you have to remember the simple fact that they sent Kuma out there to make sure that Moriah didn't lose, and then later they sent Doflamingo to kill Moriah after Marineford, and he said the order came from higher up than Sengoku. There is clearly a lot of added importance to Moriah's devil fruit for some reason, and personally I think that's because it's probably pretty close to what Imu does. Now I'm sure Imu's is better, but regardless they're probably kind of close. And there's also that theory that Thriller Bark is made from a chunk of God Valley, since it's from the West Blue, which kind of ties them together even more. But the best Imu foreshadow of all, by far, in this entire video, at least in my opinion, is this: the Thriller Bark monsters. We still have basically no idea what the hell was going on in this panel, because it's the only time we've seen it or had it mentioned, but it's a mystery that has stuck with me ever since I first saw it. You could almost feel that Oda was hinting something massive with this panel, and I'm aware that I'm far from the first person to say that this might be Imu, but there are some things that we've seen recently in the manga that we're going to get to shortly that I think really help seal the deal. But I think the first thing that we should mention is just the simple fact, you know, Imu is still all black with red eyes, and here's these giant monsters that are all black with red eyes. I know that's kind of simple, but we gotta start there, I guess. But also, we know the Gorosei could basically teleport across the world using these summoning circles, and often coming out as a giant monster afterward. So it's entirely possible that Imu would have done the same thing to get to the Florian Triangle super quick. He could have just done it right after he heard that Moriah lost, right? But then you'd have to ask the question, well, when did Imu learn that? Does the timeline match up? And it definitely does. does, because we saw Kuma report what happened to Sengoku in the very same chapter that we saw those monsters. However, when we got to their discussion, they were already mid-conversation. Kuma had already told them before we jumped to that scene that he failed to capture the Straw Hats. Oda organized this in a way to throw us off, I think, because that discussion came after we saw the monsters, so maybe we don't catch on that the timeline works. But because they were mid-conversation, that monster definitely could have appeared the instant after Kuma said they escaped. And beyond that, we saw that the narrator box called that thing the Sea's Bizarre Face, and as we already said earlier, you know, Emu spelled backwards is Umi, which means ocean, so that could play off of all the theories that people have about Emu being some type of sea devil. And I think it's truly genius that Oda had the crew right outside the fog, because that's probably the reason why Emu didn't go after them. This could simply be because Emu didn't want to reveal themselves to the world, or maybe it's because Emu can't be in the sun, which would be very interesting given that Luffy is the sun god. And we were also told that ships would go missing in the Florian Triangle even long before Thriller Bark got there, so someone or something was protecting that part of the ocean for a long time. And Emu's been around for a really long time, so that lines up too. And my favorite piece of evidence is what somebody on Thriller Bark was saying while we saw the Thriller Bark monsters, because they were talking about an amazing story called the Straw Hat Crew, A Man's Impressive Tale. And from what we saw at Laugh Tale, the One Piece involves a tale about the past. Emu spent 800 years stopping people from learning that tale of Joy Boy. And now we see a massive monster appear when someone brings up Luffy's tale? Wonder why that is. I honestly thought about doing an entire video just on this topic because I have a lot more to add to this, especially what it could mean for Emu's form and why Emu's been protecting the Florian Triangle all these years, but I don't want this video to get too much longer than it already is, so like I said earlier, if we hit 5k likes, then you'll get this video too. But all things considered, Moriah and Thriller Bark offer probably some of the craziest parallels to Emu in the entire story. It's like a wise man once told me, everything comes back to Thriller Bark. But next I'm going to go ahead and skip Sabaody and Amazon Lily, as those didn't really have arc-centric villains that we ended up defeating, and neither did Impel down to Marineford really, but I want to talk about those for just a moment more generally, because one of the things that we've really illustrated so far is that Oda loves mirroring the pre-time skip with the post-time skip. However, the Impel down in Marineford section hasn't really had a post-time skip version yet, right? And I think that's because, at least for Marineford, that's going to be the final war. I mean, even the Summit War itself threatened to end the world, so clearly the final war will do the same thing. And then as for Impel Down, I think a lot of us expect Impel Down 2.0 to happen eventually. I mean, they can't keep Bon Clay locked up forever, right? But I really doubt that Oda's going to do a whole second arc there. Instead, I think it's probably going to get off-screened. But if Oda were to parallel that in the future, then I think it might just be an arc based on the real underworld. Because as we already talked about, Impel Down is an allegory for hell from Dante's Inferno, right? So it's not the real hell, but we do know that you can visit the real hell in One Piece because Brook has been there. That's where he gets the chill from his ice powers. And again, given that they use those summoning circles, and even V Nostro uses ice powers just like Brook does, there's definitely a chance that we could go visit there. I mean, I could definitely see Luffy get like sucked into one of those circles and get taken down to hell, and then maybe Zoro has to go save him to show that he's really the king of hell. Or maybe the whole crew goes or something. Maybe we even get to see Joy Boy while we're down there. Now, of course, I don't think we're actually going to bring anyone back from the dead. I don't think Oda's ever going to do that, other than Brook, of course. But given that Brook exists, maybe we'll go back there. I don't know. I mean, if Emu does tie to the underworld, then that would make a lot of sense, I feel like. And maybe finding out what's really going on in the underworld, and maybe even hearing from people from the past, could explain how Emu got to power and what their powers really are. I mean, we've seen people go down to the underworld to save their friends or whatever in so many different stories and mythologies and all that, that I could definitely see Oda finally doing it for real instead of just using Impel Down as the stand-in. And so now we're going to go ahead and skip to the post-time skip. And admittedly, I do have fewer examples in the post-time skip because, as I mentioned, Oda recycled a lot of the pre-time skip to here, so I don't want to rehash too many of the same points. But there is something I think worth mentioning about Hody Jones. Now, I already talked about the Fishman plight and all that with Arlong, but the thing that Hody did differently was frame someone. He framed the humans so tensions got even worse, thus making it even easier for him to get a coalition on his side against the humans. I personally think that Emu did something just like this, but with the Ancient Kingdom. It reminds me of what happened at Water 7 as well, when Spandam used Frankie's battleships against innocent people. Because if Emu wanted to get this almighty, bountiful kingdom under fire, he basically had to make a false flag attack for people to rally behind. And this also goes back to what I said with Stelly, Blackbeard, and Foxy. All of these people are scummy individuals who will do dirty tricks to win. And if Emu is going to be an amalgamation of all that, well, I think this could be how it happens. I even think the hole at Ennis lobby could be the answer for all this. If Emu was able to blow up an important part of the Ancient Kingdom, but frame them for it, then people would definitely start feeling like they've gone too far and that the technology has become too powerful. But next we're going to go ahead and skip Caesar Clown because I've already mentioned Oda's obsession with clowns blowing stuff up, and we're going to go ahead and skip right to Doflamingo. Now, Dofi offers some pretty obvious parallels, I think, being an ex-celestial dragon, having a goal to take over the world, even knowing about the national treasure of Moriah, etc. But the big thing for him is that, somewhat similar to Hody, he framed the current leadership as the problem. He literally controlled King Riku and had him slaughter his own country against his will. This is what gave Doflamingo the ability to get into power, and to take back what he saw as his rightful throne because the Don Quixote used to rule there before the Void Century. And because of this, I've always wondered if the Void Century could have been something similar. What if people all around the world were forced to fight against their will? We kinda saw this with Orz and Moriah, where Moriah literally contorted Orz's body into different shapes and sizes. I mean, a whole 100 years of that kind of thing would have definitely been horrifying, and would probably justify this big mystery that Oda's been building up for so many years. And you know, since the Celestial Dragons wouldn't welcome Dofi back into the Holy Land, Doflamingo basically wanted to become nobility by force. And I think that alone serves as a lot of potential for Emu's motivations. We also know that Dofi was persecuted for his lineage, kinda like Orochi was, and that drove him to becoming who he is. Dofi is a shining example of how Oda can make these villains be objectively horrible people, but he can also make us understand why they became the way that they are. It doesn't make it okay, but it makes us feel pretty sad that the world is the way it is to drive people to be like this. That cycle of hatred just never ends, and it results in people like Doflamingo existing. And I think one of the more important connections in regards to Emu is how fixated Dofi was on the Op fruit. He mentioned several of its abilities helping him, but the immortal youth surgery was the big one. And now that we know Emu's been around for 800 years, I feel pretty confident that Emu also valued that fruit, and so I think that Doflamingo's takeover of Dressrosa is a pretty solid template for Emu's takeover of the entire world. But now we're on to one of our final villains, which is Big Mom. And I'm gonna keep this part pretty short because the main thing that I want to point out here is the use of people's souls. Big Mom took a month's worth of people's souls every 6 months just to let them live in Tato Land. And then she was able to take those souls and use them to make homies, which made the world feel more alive and happy than it truly was. It kind of created a front to hide the dark truth about how the society was really constructed. And I think that's something that we've already seen in Moriah. It's just instead of homies, they use actual slaves, which is even more inhumane. Because remember the early parts of the Reverie when that sidewalk moved automatically? They didn't know it at the time, but it was because there's slaves underneath there who are actually doing the work. It's all a way for the government to put lipstick on an ugly pig. And I mean, remember the government's native cleansings? They literally wiped out entire islands of people. And the reason we were told is that they could then get their resources. But they also made a game out of it, and even assigned bonus points to certain people. And as we saw with Big Mom's souls, and even Moriah's shadows, some are stronger than others. So I've always wondered if those sacrifices at God Valley were for more than just a game. Maybe instead, they were some way to power up Emu or the God's Knights, thus why they were all there. I mean, there's definitely a reason that as we've gotten deeper and deeper into the story, Oda's been dipping more and more into the soul or underworld area of things. And I think that's all because Emu's gone even further and taken more advantage of people than anyone else. So all of these examples we've seen with Moriah or Big Mom or otherwise are kind of like appetizers for what Emu has going on. But then our next to last villain is of course Kaido. And the big thing about him that I think Emu also emulates is waiting for Joy Boy. Or at least the belief that they'll only lose to the next coming of Joy Boy. I mean, for Emu, it might be the only person who even has a chance is Joy Boy. Because remember, Kaido lamented that Luffy couldn't be Joy Boy either, until of course he unlocked Gear 5th and then beat his ass. And when the hockey rope attack happened at Egghead, we saw Emu absolutely sweating at feeling Joy Boy's his haki again. I think the idea here between Kaido and Imu is that Oda's created some top tier combatants who are basically untouchable except when they face a certain someone, the next coming of Nika. Luffy even died first and came back to life via the awakening, which could be its own parallel to the fact that Joy Boy died but then came back through Luffy. And similarly, Kaido was a dragon and Imu is the head of the Celestial Dragons. In one of my more recent videos, I talked a lot about how Imu could very well end up being a dragon or be from a dragon race, probably a Western dragon, and that might be why Oda had Luffy awaken first versus Kaido, who is an Eastern dragon. Like I said with Big Mom, maybe this was just like an appetizer for everything Imu has going on. And so the last thing that I want to talk about here are the giants. Now I know I'm skipping Egghead, but the Gorosei parallels are probably obvious enough. I've only mentioned the circle like 15 times. And we don't really know yet who our main villain is during this arc. It could very well be the Gods Knights, it could be Loki, you know, who knows, we're still at the very start of the arc. But the biggest thing in regards to Imu is the fact that the world government has tried gigantifying people for all these years, which really makes me wonder why Imu has been so focused on that. Did Imu maybe have a hard time dealing with the giants last time around because they were on Joy Boy's side? I mean, there's a lot of really cool Void Century or just ancient history stuff that we could talk about in regards to Elbaf, but I don't want to speculate too much on that since we're kind of learning that information as we speak. But the one big thing tying to the giants that I have to mention is the serpent soaked in blood. This was something that was mentioned all the way back in Little Garden by Dorian Brogy, but I feel like it's relevant here because we still need to see where Oda's taking that. And I think most people agree that it's likely an allegory for the Red Line, thus why the giants said they couldn't break it. And that makes me wonder, what is the Red Line then? Is it just a random mountain or a chain of different islands like Nami once told us? Or could it really somehow be a giant serpent? Perhaps it's one that's encased in stone, kind of like Pluton is encased in something since it's only going to be freed once the walls fall down. And actually think about that a little bit more. Wano is sitting right on top of Pluton and Moriah is sitting right on top of the Red Line, and both of these like mountainous structures serve as a type of border, right? I mean, the Red Line is keeping Laboon out from where he wants to go, which, like I said, that's sacrilegious, and Wano's borders are keeping everyone out, especially Big Mom's crew. So that makes me wonder, if there's a serpent in there, will that thing awaken someday like Pluton's likely going to? I mean, Sukiyaki did say that Pluton was sleeping down there, and I mean, if Elbaf had these giant creatures on their island for thousands of years, maybe one of them just ended up working for Imu. I mean, the reason we've been told that Moriah stays on top of the Red Line is because, you know, they want to be above everyone else, and probably to avoid their own future flood, I would imagine. But what if it's all to protect that giant serpent in case Imu uses it? I mean, Kaido's kind of our example that sea snake-like things can be considered dragons, and again, Moriah is ran by the Celestial Dragons, so the Red Line could technically just be a dragon, I guess? And I know that all sounds absolutely crazy, but I mean, we've seen the Gorosei teleport across the world and transform into giant monsters that don't seem to be the result of devil fruits, and Imu might be the giant monster at Thriller Bark, so I would say it's at least possible. I mean, no doubt the end of the final saga is only going to get crazier and crazier from here. But alright guys, we've made it all the way to the end of the video, and if you're still watching, I want to give you a massive thank you. I hope you enjoyed this type of video, and if you did, please let me know by hitting like and subscribe. I know it was a little bit different than normal, but if you have any ideas for future ones that were in this kind of style, definitely let me know down below. Or join the Discord. We're inching closer and closer to 1,000 members, and we have a great group of people over there, and it's probably the best way to reach me directly, so make sure to check it out if you're interested. But until next time, later.